Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to do the service, but it was a little bit late because of some technical problem. However, right now we're going to practice the meditation. After the meditation, Stephen Subodha is going to give a Dhamma talk. After Dhamma talk, should be a question and answer and chanting. Right now, Ravan Chandasar is going to lead the meditation.
Now let us sit in a comfortable, upright posture to prepare ourselves to spread loving kindness thoughts. Let's empty every information we have up to now and breathe in and breathe out gently for a couple of minutes before we start doing loving kindness meditation. Breathe in, breathe out gently. Now let us generate positive energy in this way, or practice loving kindness meditation in this way. May all the living beings be physically well. May all the living beings be safe. May all the living beings be mentally well. Let's continue spreading loving kindness thoughts in this way until we hear the bell sound.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, Chandasara, leading the meditation. Right now, Subodha is going to give a Dhamma talk. Subodha, you there?
Yes, I am, Bhante.
Okay, you can start your Dhamma talk right now.
Thank you. I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. So recently I was reading a sutta out of the Anguttara Nikaya. And this one is the Bharata Sutta. And this is one of the ones that I find interesting because it's one of the examples of the Buddha giving a talk to like a non-human being. You know, Bharata is an Asura king. You know, the Asura are like sometimes translated as like titans or demigods or even demons. And in India, they're believed to be spirits that live in opposition to the devas, to the gods. And so there are various ways that they work out in various religions and philosophies in India. But in Buddhism, you know, asuras are just like human beings in that some are good, some are bad, and some are more neutral. But in any case, just like the devas would come to the Buddha and ask for guidance or teachings or just conversation, the asuras would do the same, including the asura kings. And so in this sutta, Bharata comes to the Buddha, and it's actually the Buddha that at first has a question. He asks Bharata if the asuras enjoy the ocean, enjoy the sea. And Bharata answers, "Oh yeah, of course. You know, the asuras love the sea. The ocean is wonderful." And Bharata goes on to great length in all the various ways that the ocean is wonderful, a delight, a source of joy. And then Bharata turns to the Buddha and asks a similar question, but instead about the Dhamma, about the Vinaya. You know, is that a source of joy for the religious community? And, you know, as it turns out, the Buddha says, "Oh, actually, it's much like the things you said about the ocean, about the sea." And the Buddha then goes on explaining the 8 ways that the Dhamma and the Vinaya is a source of joy for the religious community. And there are 2 examples that I especially like, and one is quite popular. You know, for those of us who've been studying Buddhism for a while, we might be familiar with the example given that like the Dhamma is like the ocean, where the ocean has the singular taste, that of salt. You know, the Dhamma has a singular taste, and that is of a release, of freedom, of extinguishment, of nibbana. And there's also another example that follows right after that, where the Buddha says that, you know, just like the ocean is filled with treasures, you know, he gives an example of like all the various precious and semi-precious stones, pearls, shells, all sorts of things that might come from the sea that are quite beautiful to us. Those that we give value to are in the ocean. In the same way, the Dhamma has its treasures. Specifically, the Buddha talks about what are sometimes called the wings to awakening. There are 37 qualities or 37 traits that we're practicing and developing, you know, skills we're developing in the path as Buddhists, beginning with, you know, the 4 establishings of mindfulness down to the Eightfold Path. And I really like that example of thinking of those things as treasures. You know, I think about, you know, how popular mindfulness is now and how it becomes this big thing that's passed around in kind of a cheap way. But, you know, what if we were to think about mindfulness and establishing mindfulness as a treasure? And this Eightfold Path that we're developing, as a treasure, as something of great value, as a source of wealth. And I like thinking of those things as wealth, because they prove to be the kind of wealth that actually matters, the kind of wealth that has true staying power for those of us developing this path within us. Because unlike the kind of wealth that exists out in the regular world, the kind of mundane world, the wealth that kind of comes and goes and seems to go to some people and not others, and there are those lacking and those that seem to have perhaps too much, and so on. The wealth that we get to develop and cultivate as Buddhists is wealth that is dependent on us and our own efforts, and stays with us and can't be taken away by anyone else, can't be given by anyone else either. That the things we're developing in the Eightfold Path, and the things that we develop in terms of mindfulness and effort, in terms of skill and faculties and strengths and so on, are all things that we are doing, things that we can rely on. And they're wealth in the truest sense, and that they are resources for us that are there in our time of need, absolutely when we need them most. And I was thinking about that especially these days in terms of the establishings of mindfulness, being mindful, having mindfulness immersed in the body, having mindfulness immersed in feeling, mindfulness immersed in the mind, and mindfulness immersed in mental objects or dhammas. That was especially useful for me recently because, a couple of weeks ago, I ended up contracting COVID, and I got quite sick. And this happened at a bit of an inopportune time in my life. I had just graduated with my Master of Divinity. And so I had been off celebrating, and, perhaps I had started to see more people and things like that. And, who's to say exactly how I got it, because, it can exist in the body for quite a while before it presents itself with symptoms. And, I have to say that it was actually quite tough for me, because I had never been sick like this before in my life. And that way, I suppose I've been quite lucky. But also, the way this virus worked through my body was very different from what I had ever experienced before. Like anyone else in the world, I've had a cold or the flu before, and I've had my exposure to like having fevers and chills and body aches, and I had all of that. Initially the symptoms seemed to be very, very much like a cold, very much like a flu. I had my fever, and I was sitting on the couch and shivering and aching and getting hot as usual. And I even had some of the other symptoms of COVID that show, a little later or quite suddenly, or however it works out. I lost my sense of smell and taste, which was strange. Usually when someone has a cold or a flu, it's kind of a temporary thing, and mostly because the nose is stuffy. But this was an absolute complete loss of smell and taste. It was very strange. But one of the symptoms of COVID that I hadn't experienced with any other kind of virus or any kind of sickness before was the shortness of breath. Now, that's something that I ended up having quite strongly for a period of maybe 3-4 days. It's hard to keep track because all the days started blurring together. Now, that shortness of breath ended up feeling like something quite different, quite strange, because it wasn't due to a stuffy nose. It felt like, the lungs themselves. I would try to take a full breath, and it felt very constricted and tight in my lungs. And I would try to breathe through my mouth and take big gulps of air, and it wouldn't quite work. And it got so bad that during that 3 to 4 day period, I was unable to sleep, because every time I tried to sleep, it felt like I was drowning. So one night in particular, I got out of bed, because there was really no use in staying in bed, came out to the living room in my home, sat down, and tried to meditate. And in the midst of that meditation, I was continuing to have that feeling of drowning, of suffocating. And I began to worry, like, ooh, how serious is this going to be for me? Now, I don't want to make anyone think that I was in any danger. I was the whole time checking on my blood oxygen level. And the healthy range of blood oxygen is anywhere from 95 to 100. And it's only if it starts going lower than that, then it's time to become concerned. And during this whole period, as I was continuing to check my blood oxygen, it never dipped below 96. And most of the time it was between 98 and 100. So having that evidence, I knew that my body was getting the oxygen it required. But essentially, this virus, the way it was attacking me, I ended up feeling as if essentially I were being waterboarded. I was having the sensation of drowning without actually drowning. And so when I was trying to meditate, I had to make use of skillful mindfulness to really, really meditate in a special way. Those of you who've known me for a while know that my object of meditation is the breath. And throughout my whole life, breathing has been pretty easy. I've never been someone with asthma. I haven't had any breathing issues. I typically don't get sick in a way that affects my breathing. And so here I was with this acute shortness of breath, this sensation that I could not fully breathe. And yet my body was getting the oxygen it needed. And I needed to remind myself of that. And so that's what I mean about having to apply mindfulness in a particular way. We often assume these days that mindfulness is simply awareness, just being aware of things as they are. And I got to tell you that if that were my approach to mindfulness, I would be aware, just even more acutely aware of what I already was aware of, which was the sensation of drowning, the sensation of suffering, this feeling of suffocating. And so I couldn't approach my meditation, my mindfulness of breathing, as simply being aware. And lucky enough, the way the Buddha would teach mindfulness, he did not teach it as simply bare awareness. In fact, when the Buddha would talk about mindfulness, he always talked about it in terms of three qualities, one of them being mindfulness. He would always talk about it in terms of ardency, alertness, and mindfulness. Mindfulness itself, not simply being aware, because that would fall under being alert, but rather to keep something in mind, to keep things in mind, including the teachings, including the Dhamma. So that meant that as I sat there that night, as I felt like I was suffocating, I had to apply ardency and alertness and mindfulness. I was ardent in the sense that I was actually bringing real determination to the meditation. I was sitting there with real effort to develop good qualities. I was there sitting with real determination to keep my mind on the breath, despite the breath being very difficult. I also had to apply alertness and realizing that even though the lungs themselves were having this sensation of suffocation, the sensation of drowning, the body itself was still getting all the oxygen it required. This kind of alertness was important because in the traditions I've studied, when we practice mindfulness of breathing, it's not simply the sensation of the breath as it comes through the nose or the lift and fall of the diaphragm, but learning to feel the sensation of breathing, the energy of the breath throughout the entire body. Some people describe it as like a humming sensation, a vibrating sensation. For me, it tends to be a sense of vitality, the sense that every cell in my body is continuing to breathe, this process of bringing in oxygen and feeding on that oxygen and then expelling carbon dioxide and feeling that energy travel through the whole body. And it is a sense of feeling alive. And so that meant that my alertness couldn't rest simply on my nose or on my lungs or on my diaphragm, but I had to expand that awareness to include the whole body, to feel the breath all the way down to my toes and my fingertips, to reside in my body and feel the breath as it traveled through. And so that became a special way that I was applying ardency, alertness, and mindfulness. Beyond that, we can think of these establishings of mindfulness that the Buddha considers to be a treasure, something that is of real worth and value. It meant that as I was meditating, I was not only meditating on the sensation of breath, but I was meditating immersed in the body itself, feeling everything from the top of my head down to my toes. And I was also immersed in the feeling tones of my meditation. That meant that I was trying to be aware of the feeling of pleasure, the feeling of dissatisfaction, the neutral feelings in the body, pleasure, pain, and neither pleasure nor pain as it existed in the body. And I got to tell you, when I started applying it this way, it was very fascinating to watch the way this was traveling through my body, because we might assume that because I had this feeling that night, this feeling of suffocation, that was the only feeling I was having. But that turned out to not be true as I looked at my body, as I looked at the feelings traveling through my body, that there were places that were at ease, that were peaceful, that even felt pleasurable. And I was able to bring my attention to those places, to reside in those places, and come to a fuller awareness of the way I was feeling, and to nurture that, to not simply be aware that there were places in my body that were pleasurable, but to actually use that as a place to rest, as a place to find nourishment in, so that I was not suffering so acutely as I sat there that night. Beyond that, I was also aware of what was going on in my mind, because having not been through something like this before, to not have this acute sensation of shortness of breath, I sat there with a lot of feelings emerging in the mind. I could feel the panic there as I struggled to breathe. I could feel the sensations and the thoughts that accompanied them, the feelings that accompanied them, the thoughts of worry, of whether or not I would get better, of whether or not this moment in my life would end. But I could also see the way my mind responded to my ability to shift over to the pleasant sensations in the body, and my ability to reside and rest on those points as they existed. And I could then at that point find areas in my mind where I was able to rely on that sense of peace, that sense of rapture, that sense of bliss, and that sense of calm. One of the reasons why we meditate is to have a calm center, to have that calm center that can exist for us as we go through something very difficult, as we struggle through something very dangerous and scary, even if it's just the perception, the feeling of something scary, even though we might still be quite okay. Because as I said, I've been continuing to check on my blood oxygen, and I was breathing. I simply was lacking the sensation. Now, I got to be honest, the situation wasn't helped much by the lack of sense of smell and the way that my nerves had been attacked. My face also felt really numb. So I couldn't even feel air as it moved through my nose or my mouth. And to top it off, my wife had put a simmering pot on to help us with the humidity in the apartment to try to open up our sinuses. What that had done, though, was created an outside temperature and kind of sensation that just seemed to match the body itself. So it actually, for me, made me feel even less like I was breathing. So it was a funny thing to sit as a meditator that meditates on the breath, and to not only have the feeling of shortness of breath, but even when breathing, to feel as if there was no breath. So again, to reiterate, that's why it was so important to sit immersed in the body, to sit immersed in feeling, to sit immersed in the mind, because I could see more clearly what was going on and utilize what was happening and make it useful, make it skillful, so that I could have that calm center that I was relying on, existing in. Now, that night eventually did pass, but it didn't pass with any sleep. Even though I was able to utilize mindfulness in terms of ardency and alertness and mindfulness itself. And I was able to rely on the four establishings of being immersed in the body and feeling the mind, mental objects. That doesn't mean that my symptoms disappeared. I didn't miraculously get better that night, and I still wasn't able to sleep that night. But I was able to do something that allowed me to rest that night, that allowed me to get through that night. And then eventually the sun did rise. And eventually my wife woke up to keep me company. She was also sick with COVID, but at least we were sick together. And as I went through that, and as I utilized that, these establishings of mindfulness, I could really see how they are treasures. They are a treasure, a kind of wealth, a kind of resource that I was able to use. Now, I couldn't avoid sickness because sickness is inevitable, simply a matter of time. But I also wasn't powerless in the face of my sickness either, in the face of this feeling, this sensation, as my body was being attacked by a virus. Now, I think about how many people have had the same virus within the last couple of years. And I think about all the various ways that people suffer with old age and sickness and death. And so I can only think that there must be some way in which this is relatable to others today as well. Whether it is something that you felt in the past, or something that you might feel now in the present, or something that might happen for you in the future. And certainly it will in the future. There might be some good in sharing this experience that I had. Some way that it might be applicable to you. And at the very least, some way of helping or showing, being modeling or exempling. There's so many ways I could try to say the same thing. The fact that these things that we develop aren't simply just fanciful philosophies or just a spiritual way of thinking, but have real world application. A real way of minimizing our suffering in this very moment, even as we try to develop ourselves towards enlightenment, towards liberation, towards nibbana. That when we actually do put these things into practice, as we face life's challenges, we end up finding what the Buddha called a pleasant abiding here and now. And so by putting that into practice, I was able that night and the nights that followed until I started to improve, to have a measure of a pleasant abiding in the present moment, despite all the things that I was feeling, despite the ways I was hurting. And of course, I'm using mindfulness as an example, but it's true of the entirety of the path, to think of them in terms of being treasures, in terms of being wealth. Even as we look at the Eightfold Path, we could see how the views that we hold as Buddhists can be treasures, can be wealth. We can think of the resolves that we have, the determinations we have as we approach the path. We can think of the way we speak and the way we act, our very livelihood. And then, of course, we can think about the ways we meditate, the way we cultivate mentally, the way we develop, practice bhavana. These things that we develop inside ourselves. As we approach even the Brahma Viharas, looking at, goodwill and compassion and, empathetic joy and equanimity. All of these things are treasures that we have buried inside us. When we think about a treasure on its own has no value. If we think about some kind of pirate's treasure, existing in some chest somewhere, if it's off buried in the sand or deep in a cave or at the bottom of the ocean, it serves no purpose. It has no value. The value is in uncovering it and discovering it and bringing it out to the surface and utilizing it, putting it to use. So all these things that we develop, all these things that we cultivate within ourselves, exist in ourselves as potentials, as possibilities. And when we actually put them to use, when we bring them up to the surface and bring them out and extend them outward, God, what treasure we're sharing with others, what treasure and wealth we're sharing and using for ourselves. And we can see how this path we're developing is for our benefit, but also the benefit of others. So my example of this very dark night that I went through was one where I was able to uncover some measure of treasure, maybe a couple gold coins, maybe a pearl, I don't know, but something worth sharing. And maybe in the sharing, it becomes something that motivates and inspires you to look within yourselves and see what treasures might exist there, what wealth might be inside you, what resources exist within that can see you through the ups and downs of life, the uncertainty of it all. When we go through something really scary, and mileage may vary for all of us, but for me, this was scary. What gets us through? So I'm grateful to this path that I'm on, this path that I'm developing, that allowed me to get through it, that allows me to get through all the things that my life has been. And again, mileage may vary. You might look at my life and see it as pretty cozy, and maybe. But each one of us is trying just to get through all the things that the Buddha said that life is, this continuous wandering on that is samsara. It's not just old age, sickness, and death. Those are just the ones we focus on, but it's the very inconstancy of life itself as a source of happiness that is reliable. If we're too outwardly focused or outwardly focused at all, really, we end up finding sources of happiness that don't last, that aren't reliable. So I was on that night able to find something I could rely on, which wasn't the medication I was taking, although that did help. And it wasn't, reading articles on WebMD or anything else online. That didn't really help either. I could have read more suttas and done a lot of other things in terms of study. And that is always helpful. But what was most helpful was actually putting it all into practice, putting these treasures to use, these resources to use. And I find as time goes on and I continue developing this path, that's when it becomes really fruitful. That's when I see the benefit of this path, is putting it into practice. And again, I've been using mindfulness as an example, but this goes for every part of the practice. For us in the West, we might also need to look at the precepts as a kind of treasure, a kind of resource, a kind of wealth that when applied, when really put into practice, ends up being a gift that we give ourselves and a gift we give others. And so I could say more, but I think I'd just be reiterating the same points. In either case, I do hope that what I shared today acts or is a motivation and encouragement to look within and see what resources you have developed or exist as a potential that you can continue to develop. Something that really is useful, which really is reliable, which really does lead to a measure of calm, of peace and happiness, even right now, as we continue on the path. Thank you so much for listening.
Subodh, if anybody have any question, any comment, you can ask the Subodh.
Okay. Let's see. I think maybe I saw Victor first. Go ahead.
I just want to say I'm glad you're better.
Thank you
for the talk today.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Victor. Tiknutamza. You're still muted. Yeah.
I'm not fully awake yet. My Dharma name given by my teacher is Tiknu Tamza, when I got ordained. It was really good to hear you. I could relate to everything because I'm sick with the flu. I thought I was over it. I got tested for COVID when I was in the hospital 2 weeks ago because I was in so much pain. And it was more than flu then. But they tested me for COVID and I tested negative, which I've gotten every shot. Now, I'm not looking for things to worry about. I used to do that. If I didn't have something to worry about, I would find something. Now, being a longtime Buddhist and practicing, I don't look. But I am aware that monkeypox is now in 30 states here in the US. And I can only imagine, I mean, it's like the era of influenza. And I work a lot with birds, and that's where the flu comes from, birds. It's influenza for birds. Every flu strain comes from birds except monkeypox comes from monkeys. And I can't imagine that being any fun. That sounds like like a killer disease. Like monkeys shouldn't be hassled with in the wild. You shouldn't capture them and cook them, which is done and makes me insane. And then leave the monkey paw on the table as a decoration. Yeah. And people wonder where monkeypox comes from. But, you know, in a way, I'm glad, slightly off topic, but I'm glad the animals are, you know, fighting back, even if it's unwillingly, by sharing viruses that they've lived with for millions of years and we've never been exposed to, because they were protected by jungles. And now that we've gone in to mine the jungles and everywhere in the world, South America, Brazil tearing down all its forests. I mean, I was there and I can tell you what's going to come out of the Brazilian forest. That's going to be really interesting because it's an eco balance, and they, you know, whoever they are, the contractors, the people who have figured out to buy parts of the Amazon, you know, locals, Brazilians, they're just chopping down trees.
Yeah.
So, but going back to what you were saying, I have been doing deep meditation.
Meera, thank you for your comment. And if anybody have any question, ask very shortly, quickly, short question. If not, we go to chant in the chanting book.
You know, I got to say, whenever I give a talk and there aren't a lot of questions afterward, my wife likes to tell me, you know, it's because you were so clear. Everyone just has no questions because you were just so on point. Now, that might just be my wife gassing me up because she's my wife. But if you do have questions right now and you're kind of waffling on whether or not to ask, it's a good time to ask. Yeah, we still have a couple minutes before we have to chant. So if there's something that you have any question about in terms of the Dhamma, feel free to ask. And if not, that's okay.
All right, David, you have any question or comment?
Hey, Shanti. No, I have no questions right now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, David. Subodha, thanks for the. It's a great talk. I'm happy also because you are just recover. So take care of yourself and hope to see you again soon. So we're going to chant right now. Page 4 and page 10. Just want to say to everybody, thanks for the join with us, but make sure to ask your question very shortly. All right. We're going to chant the page 4 and page 10. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham saranam gacchami, Dhammam saranam gacchami, Sangham saranam gacchami. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Deluding persons are inexhaustible. I vow to end them all. Dharma grades are limitless. I vow to study them all. Buddha's way is supreme. I vow to attain it. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shall grieve, and the sick find health relief. May all merits be extended to everyone, that we together with all beings may gain Buddha's way. Om Mani Padme Hum. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you for everybody. Again, thank you, Subodha. Next Sunday, I believe the 12th, next Sunday, Venerable Tri Dao is going to give a Dhamma talk. He's Vietnamese American monks living in Florida. Last week I talked with him. He said he can give a talk next Sunday, which is, I believe, the 12th of the June. So I hope everybody will join again. And if you like to come to the temple, you can come Sunday service time, Sunday around 11, and you can join with us meditation and everything. So sometime few people's coming. So we hope to put the big screen here, then people can see who's giving Dhamma talk and everything. So again, thanks for everybody. By the power of the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, by the power of all the Bodhisattvas, you all be well and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.